6 months. This is the time the unconscious needs to destroy the character you call I. Most people spend their entire lives trying to change the scenery, when what needs to change is who is playing the role. Carl Jung proved that you don't need luck. You need courage to look in the mirror, because while the ego tries to fix the world, the self tries to fix you. And whoever ignores this call repeats it, repeats loves, repeats mistakes, repeats pain. But whoever accepts is reborn. In 6 months, you may still be the same sleeping consciousness, or become someone your past wouldn't recognize. And if that scares you, it's because the process has already begun. Sign up now, because here, no one will teach you how to find yourself. We're going to make you stop getting lost. There comes a moment when the soul tires of repeating the same chapters with different names. The face changes, the job changes, the scenery changes, but the emptiness remains the same. This is the point where the unconscious begins to cry out for transformation. Carl Jung called this the beginning of the individuation process. When the ego, tired of controlling everything, begins to hear the whispers of the self. This is when spirituality ceases to be a concept and becomes survival. Life, until then a theater, begins to reveal its cracks. The I you created to be accepted becomes too small to contain the awakening soul. And in this conflict between what dies and what wants to be born, something begins to burn within. It is the fire that announces the birth of consciousness. The call of transformation never arrives with flowers. It arrives as collapse, loss, disorder. The unconscious doesn't awaken you subtly, it rips the ground away. You lose control, your certainties, the glow of your ego, and you feel lost. But it is in this helplessness that spirituality begins. The psyche pushes you into the darkness not to punish, but to reveal. Jung said that the soul only matures when it is wounded, and this wound is the portal. It is when the ego begins to fragment that the self finally has space to be born. Many mistake this collapse for failure, but it is initiation. It is the end of the false so that the real can breathe. Those who understand the call don't run away. They observe, they allow, they accept chaos as part of the integration process. Because everything the unconscious destroys, it destroys out of love. So when everything within you begins to crumble, remember, it's not the end. It's the beginning of the transformation the ego feared and the soul awaited. At the first signs of rupture, a relationship that collapses, a purpose that loses its meaning, a mirror that shows weariness, you are not breaking, you are being summoned. And if you answer this call, the next step will be inevitable, discovering that almost everything you call change was just an escape. Most people spend their lives changing scenery, so they don't have to change themselves. They change their address, their lover, their haircut, but their unconscious remains intact, orchestrating the same plots with new characters. Carl Jung warned, as long as the ego tries to fix life from the outside in, it will remain a slave to its own projections. True spirituality doesn't begin with a change of country, but with a change of perspective. You can cross oceans, but if you don't cross your own unconscious, you'll live in the same desert. The transformation you seek isn't in the new, it's in what you avoid revisiting. That's why the same patterns return. They're not coincidences, they're invitations. The ego believes that evolving means piling up achievements, a new job, a new status, a new relationship. But all of this is just a reorganization of the theater. The character changes costumes, but the play remains the same. You fall in love with the same kind of pain, work for the same reasons as before, flee from the same silences. The unconscious is relentless. It repeats until you learn. Each repetition is an unread letter from the self. And the more you try to change the world outside, the more it shows you that the prison is within. Jung said that each person's destiny is a reflection of the unconscious they carry. Therefore, true exile is not geographic, it is psychological. To break this cycle, it takes courage to look within and admit that you are the common denominator of everything that repeats itself. There is no healing without this brutal honesty. Want to change your life? Stop setting the stage. Close your eyes, dismantle the stage, and face the actor. This is the border between escape and transformation. When you finally accept that external change is merely anesthesia, the impulse to seek what is real arises. And what is real? Everything the unconscious tried to show you in the shadows, the traits you deny, the feelings you repress, the faces that mirror you. This is where the real work begins, the encounter with the shadow. There's a moment in the journey when the mirror shatters, and what returns the gaze is no longer the ego, but everything it tried to bury. It's the beginning of the encounter with the shadow. Carl Jung said that the shadow contains everything consciousness has rejected in order to be accepted. Anger, pride, fear, desire, ambition, vulnerability. The problem is that what is repressed doesn't disappear. It merely disguises itself. You see it projected onto others, on the arrogant person who irritates you, the fragile person who disgusts you, the free person who arouses your envy. The shadow isn't in them. It's within you, crying out for integration. Spirituality without this encounter is fantasy, because there is no light that doesn't pierce the darkness before it shines. The ego fears the shadow because it reveals that the good you believe yourself to be may simply be a fear of rejection. How many times have you been kind out of cowardice? How many times have you remained silent for fear of losing approval? This is where the shadow reigns. It exposes the hidden motivations behind apparent virtue, the humble who actually hide from their own greatness, the strong who avoid feeling, the pure who judge to avoid facing their own pain. Jung said that the shadow is 90% gold, 10% fear. Gold is the vital energy you've imprisoned, trying to appear good. Therefore, integrating the shadow isn't about becoming evil, it's about becoming whole. Want to see the shadow up close? Observe what irritates you, what attracts you, and what hurts you. Each trigger is a mirror. When you feel anger, ask yourself, why is he like this? Instead, why does this affect me? Start noting your emotional patterns, the situations that repeat themselves, the people who destabilize you, the compliments that bother you. These are the traces of the unconscious trying to emerge. This mapping is the beginning of liberation. And when you have the courage to look at what you fear most, something profound will happen. The invisible will begin to respond. It is at this point that dialogue with the unconscious becomes inevitable. Once you face the shadow, the silence begins to speak. This is where Carl Jung introduces what is perhaps his most profound contribution to spirituality: active imagination. The unconscious reveals itself not through logical reasoning, but through symbols, images, and inner voices that the ego has learned to ignore. When you begin to listen to them, something changes. It's not madness, it's symbolic lucidity. It's the self beginning to respond. The dialogue with the invisible doesn't happen in temples or retreats. It happens in the early hours of the morning when you close your eyes and ask yourself, why is this in my life? What does this part want to show me? The answer never comes in words. It comes in sensations, in dreams, in flashes of understanding. The exercise is simple, but it requires courage. Choose an aspect of your shadow, anger, jealousy, fear, neediness, and personify it. Give it form, a face, a voice. Ask, what do you want to teach me? And listen, really listen. This is where the ego trembles, because what returns is not what it expected. Anger reveals that it always wanted to protect you. Fear, that it only wanted to keep you whole. Neediness, that it only yearned for authenticity. Integration begins here, when you stop fighting against it and begin to understand. It is the first step in transformation, ceasing to be your own enemy. Over time, this dialogue becomes a sacred practice. You realize that within you lies a living counsel, an unconscious that doesn't want to destroy you, but to reconstruct you. Writing, meditating, creating art, walking in silence, everything can become a channel for this listening. Each symbol is a bridge, each emotion a message. And as you learn to converse with the invisible, something silently rearranges itself. The ego ceases to command. The self begins to guide. This is the point at which the psyche reorganizes itself, preparing for what is to come, the inevitable dissolution of the old self, the night of the ego. There comes a time when the ego, accustomed to controlling everything, realizes it no longer controls anything, and it is at this moment that the downfall begins, the dark night that Carl Jung described as the collapse of the old identity. The ego tries to resist, seeks blame, creates crises, dramatizes, invents distractions, but nothing works. The soul no longer wants survival, it wants rebirth. This is the moment when psychic defenses crumble and life begins to reveal its brutality. Relationships break down, projects lose meaning, beliefs disintegrate. It is the self saying, "Enough pretending." Spirituality here is not comfort, it is fire. A fire that burns away what is false so that the true can breathe. That night, the ego screams, "I am dying," and it is. But what dies isn't you. It's the version of you that believed you were all you were. It's the character who spent years acting strong while begging for love. It's the controller who believed he was safe while living imprisoned. This is the pain of individuation, losing what was never real. Jung said that the unconscious, when ignored, destroys, but when listened to, it transforms. This destruction is the baptism of the new self. And here, there is no map. All that remains is to trust the process. It's to accept that the old psychic system must die to make way for the integration of ego and unconscious. The danger is trying to go back. The ego will convince you that it was easier before, that the chaos is unbearable, that the old version can still be saved. But it can't. Everything the unconscious touches transforms. This crossing is irreversible. It's Jung's point of no return. What remains is to cross the abyss with your eyes open, endure the silence, and let the old identity dissolve. Because on the other side, something is waiting, not a new character, but a new structure of being. And when this structure begins to emerge, what emerges is no longer the ego trying to control, but the self beginning to guide. After the death of the ego, there is a different silence, a silence that is not empty, but space. The self begins to move, not as an explosion, but as a return. It is a force you feel but cannot control. Carl Jung said that the self is not something you create. It is something that reveals itself when the ego finally falls silent. It is as if a new internal order begins to form, broader, more real, more alive. You realize you no longer need to prove anything. The same situations that once unbalanced you now only observe you. The unconscious, once an enemy, becomes a collaborator. The body breathes differently. The mind speaks less. The soul speaks more. This is the transformation that cannot be learned from books. It is the one born of one's own ruin. Individuation doesn't make you perfect, it makes you whole. The self doesn't seek to eliminate the human, it seeks to inhabit it completely. You begin to feel compassion for your past selves. Fear, pride, mistakes all become raw material for consciousness. You realize that the enemy was never the world, but the part of you that insisted on controlling it. True spirituality isn't running away from pain, it's understanding it until it dissolves. When the self awakens, even suffering gains purpose. Every loss becomes a symbol, every tear becomes a ritual. It's as if the soul finally takes the helm and says, "Now I'm in charge." But the birth of the self is not an ending, it is a turning point. Because when the self awakens, it begins to communicate. And this communication is subtle, symbolic, mysterious. It comes through dreams that change tone, coincidences that repeat themselves, messages that emerge at just the right moment. Jung called this the living language of the unconscious, the soul's signals trying to confirm the new path. What comes now is no longer introspection, it is listening. The self speaks in codes, and those who have learned to listen to the invisible begin to see what few perceive. The signals of the unconscious. When the self awakens, the world begins to speak a different language. It's the unconscious responding to the psyche's new vibration. Dreams, coincidences, sensations, everything begins to carry a precision that the ego would call chance. Carl Jung called this synchronicity, the point at which the outer world and the inner world cease to be two. You dream of someone, and that person calls you. You think about changing direction, and a symbol appears with exactly the answer. These are not random events, they are coded messages from the unconscious, confirming the process of individuation. It's as if the universe becomes a living mirror, reflecting the soul's transformation. Dreams at this stage become the script of your evolution. At first, they're chaotic. Chases, escapes, frightening symbols. It's the unconscious trying to get your attention. But as you integrate the shadow and the self emerges, dreams change tone. They begin to show reconciliations, passages, symbolic deaths, births. It's the ego dying and the self being born in symbolic language. Jung believed that recording dreams was a way to document the dialogue between the conscious and unconscious. And it's not just writing, it's talking to them, asking, "What do you want to show me?" Each dream is a letter from the soul, and each symbol is a compass pointing to what needs to be born or die. Beyond dreams, synchronicities begin to multiply, small impossibilities that defy logic. A song plays with the exact phrase you needed to hear. A book falls from the shelf open to the page that explains what you were feeling. A stranger says the phrase your soul has been waiting for. The unconscious and the self are in dialogue, and reality rearranges itself to accompany them. This frightens the ego, but delights the soul. Because it is at this point that you realize the transformation is not just internal. The entire world begins to respond to your new frequency. And this is the prelude to the deepest dive of all, the marine night and the return. Every birth requires a dark passage. Jung called this dive the night of the sea, the silent journey through the belly of the unconscious, where the old dissolves so the new can emerge. It is the stage in which the self, already awakened, must test its strength in the depths. It is when everything that has been learned must be lived, not just understood. And life, merciless and wise, begins to tear away the last masks, false bonds, dreams that no longer belong, old securities. Everything begins to crumble. It is not punishment, it is purification. The unconscious, now in partnership with the soul, begins to disintegrate what no longer serves, and this collapse is a rite. The sea swallows what was ego to return what is essence. The marine night isn't poetic while it's happening. It's disorienting. It's waking up without recognizing who you are. It's seeing your world crumble and yet feeling a strange peace. It's the paradox of true spirituality, losing everything to finally feel whole. Jung said that those who try to escape this plunge prolong their own suffering. Because the unconscious doesn't negotiate with the ego, it redeems it. And redemption comes in the form of surrender. You only get through this night when you stop swimming against the current and allow the sea to carry you. This surrender is the most courageous act of transformation. It's admitting, I'm no longer in control, and maybe I never was. At the bottom of this symbolic ocean, something begins to shift. Silence becomes guiding. Pain gains meaning. And little by little, the self begins to rebuild what the ego destroyed. But now, the foundation is different, truer, more stable, more alive. When you emerge from this night, the world is no longer the same, or perhaps it is, but whoever sees it is no longer the same. The return is not a new beginning, it is a rebirth. And when the soul returns to the surface, bearing the marks of the crossing, it discovers that it can no longer return to what it was. This is where the most mysterious and inevitable stage of individuation begins, the irreversible crossing. There comes a point when transformation ceases to be a choice and becomes destiny. It's when the ego tries to return, but can no longer find a way. Carl Jung called this the point of no return, the moment when the soul definitively takes over. You look back at the past and it seems too small, like clothes that no longer fit. What once made sense now weighs you down. What once held you back now suffocates you. There's no way to untransform. It's a kind of silent death, the mourning of the old self, but it's also the birth of a lucidity that can no longer be forgotten. The unconscious and the self, now allies, work together. The psyche achieves a new harmony, and the chaos that once broke you now teaches you. This crossing is brutal because it disorganizes everything built on fear. Friends drift away, projects die, identities unravel. And yet, there is a strange serenity, as if a deep part knows nothing is going wrong. The ego calls it loss, the self calls it liberation. It's when you stop fighting the current and start moving with it. The unconscious is no longer an enemy, it's a compass, and all resistance begins to seem absurd. You understand that pain is not punishment, it is purification. That collapse is not failure, it is reorganization. That chaos is not the end, it is the bridge. This is the wisdom the soul gains when it crosses the night and does not die in it. After this point, everything changes, not dramatically, but profoundly. You begin to perceive life as an extension of the unconscious. Synchronicities become your natural language. Fear becomes a tool, silence a direction. This is where the self begins to guide every step. The ego doesn't disappear, it learns to serve, and the external world realigns itself according to the new internal order. This irreversible crossing marks the return to truth. You are no longer the one who survives, but the one who creates. And it is in this new awareness that something unprecedented begins to emerge, what Jung called the true beginning of real life. After the crossing, the world seems the same, but everything inside you has shifted. What once hurt you now merely touches and leaves. What once controlled you now dissolves the moment it's seen. Carl Jung said that the true sign of individuation is serenity in the face of what once created chaos. This isn't indifference, it's awareness. The self begins to occupy the space that once belonged to the ego, and life ceases to be survival and becomes expression. You no longer seek meaning, you are the meaning. Spirituality ceases to be a search and becomes presence. The unconscious, once a labyrinth, is now known territory, and the fear of getting lost gives way to the curiosity to expand. Real life isn't perfect, it's alive. You feel sadness, anger, love, and silence with the same gratitude. Everything is part of the same flow. The self doesn't divide the world into right and wrong. It understands it as movement. Individuation isn't a spiritual trophy, it's a return to humanity. You begin to see beauty even in pain because you understand that it too is the language of the soul. The people who stand in your way aren't those who feed your ego, but those who touch your unconscious and remind you of who you are. Everything becomes simpler, And in this simplicity lies a power the ego never imagined, the power to exist in peace. But this is not the end. The self is not a destination. It is a state of constant expansion. True transformation is not something achieved, it is something inhabited. Now, each step is a continuation of the dialogue with the unconscious. Each day, a new integration, each silence, a new revelation. Real life begins when you understand that awakening is not the summit of the mountain. It is the first conscious step onto the solid ground of the soul. And it is here that the cycle closes to open another, the eternal return to the center where consciousness and the unconscious dance, and transformation is renewed in silence. Did you notice? Life never wanted to punish you, it just wanted to wake you up. Everything that broke in you wasn't bad luck, it was method. The unconscious knew what it was doing when it tore you away from your certainties, because the ego needs to die for the soul to breathe. Now tell me, how many times will you repeat the same pattern, pretending it's fate? How many times will you run away from the mirror that shows you what you most need to see? You still think you have time, but time is up. The next 6 months will pass anyway. The difference is whether you will continue to survive or if it will finally begin to exist. If this tore you up inside, sign up now, because that was just the first cut.